So, welcome back to another counter-apologetics segment with Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This week I'll be focusing on belief and whether we have control over our beliefs. In other words, when theists, for example, claim that people can willfully shut out God from their hearts, or when Pascal produced his wager that on balance we should just choose to believe, it assumes that we have voluntary control over our beliefs. And this is called, in philosophical fancy speak, Doxastic voluntarism, with doxastic meaning pertaining to belief, and the obvious meaning that we can voluntarily will or control our beliefs. So the idea at its most extreme implies that I can simply decide to believe, say that the moon is made of cheese. However, this is ridiculous. I couldn't make myself believe this. In order to believe it, I would require a certain amount of evidence. At some point, there would be an evidence threshold over which the evidence mounts, which would switch me from disbelief to belief. It is this threshold, it appears to me, which is involuntary. I cannot control that threshold, which decides whether I would believe a claim or not. It is an automatic threshold, I would posit. Now, as a determinist, or at least someone who denies libertarian free will, which is I define as the ability to choose otherwise in a given situation, I deny doxastic voluntarism. If I was in a causal circumstance which included every atom from the Big Bang to now, every piece of learning, every variable, and I decided to believe in the 9/11 conspiracy theory at this point, and then I went on living for 10 minutes, and then rewound back to that moment of deciding, given that everything down to every single subatomic particle and piece of reasoning variable would be identical, on what basis could I then decide not to believe in that conspiracy theory? In other words, absent of evidence and causality, any decision to believe would be random and not based on any rational foundation. We don't just decide things in spite of evidence and reasoning. And of course, given that causal circumstance, you end up deciding one thing or another. But it's not like we can just will to decide something, and in that same situation, in an alternate reality, not will to believe something. But this free will line, though very closely connected, is not fundamental to arguments of doxastic voluntarism, or DV, as I will now call it, because I clearly will stumble over those words. There are lots of arguments against DV and objections to them, and the scope of a 5-minute chat means that I'm not going to be able to cover them. So as ever, remain skeptical of what I say and do your own research. All the arguments, both for and against DV, have their detractors, that's for sure. So it's very difficult to have a clear, decisive conclusion as to whether DV exists or not. The point being, for me at any rate, is that we form our beliefs on the basis of evidence, not desire, though cognitive biases play a large part in how much value we ascribe to different evidences. Some cognitive biases assume a desire as driving a belief. For example, I may be susceptible to beliefs in conspiracy theories, and this desire to find supporting evidence in the form of confirmation bias seems to be rooted in a desire for the beliefs to be true. But this desire is itself the result of evidence and causal influences. Again, we refer back to the free will situation. And given that, for example, certain cognitive groups are more predisposed to believe in conspiracy theories than others. So there are obviously other things at play other than merely just deciding to believe. Some philosophers believe that we do have control, some that we don't, others that we have indirect control over effects which do affect our beliefs, and others still that we don't have control but can still be praised or blamed for having beliefs. Either way, evidentialism, that our beliefs are based on relevant evidence, is the dominant belief. As mentioned, some philosophers will say that while we don't have control over a belief itself, we do have control over certain variables which lead to that belief. And this is called indirect doxastic voluntarism. This might be the decision to go to church, to listen to the pastor or vicar, to read certain books, which all then lends itself to the eventual belief in, say, God. In these cases, I would defer to the previously made free will point again in denying that the causal influences for these decisions are under voluntary control, in the sense that we could not have done otherwise in those given situations. So what drove us to speak to the vicar? What drove us to go to church, to read those certain books? And again, we need to unpick those decisions themselves and the causal influences on them. On direct DV, one can see problems in deciding to believe something and having a layer of consciousness which predates that decision to believe something. So, for example, take the 9/11 conspiracy theory, that it was all sort of a government hash job. Imagine that I didn't believe that it was a conspiracy theory. Not greatly, maybe 60-40. I just didn't believe it was a conspiracy theory. So then, on DV, one assumes that I can just decide to suddenly believe that it's a conspiracy theory. However, there must be this layer of consciousness which is just under that, having literally just been disbelieving of it, that if I thought that it was a truth claim that the 9/11 wasn't a conspiracy before, that wouldn't just disappear. So then choosing to believe, I'd have this cognitive dissonance in my head whereby I had one belief which I haven't really eradicated. There's no extra evidence I've just found. I've just suddenly decided to believe in the conspiracy theory, whereas I didn't before. And this kind of cognitive dissonance would be at play. So it leads one to intuitively think that DV just can't be true. There are plenty of philosophical arguments against them, as I've mentioned. There's also an inductive argument, sort of observational argument, which doesn't disprove it, but it is interesting to add to the mix. A chap called Edwin Curley contended that regardless of whether DV was conceptually impossible or not, it's just plainly false. He says if it was true, we would actually have compelling evidence of this happening, but we just don't have evidence of us having these particular situations of being able to suddenly decide stuff. He gives an example as follows. Consider the recent meteorological conditions on Jupiter. We do not have compelling evidence either confirming or disconfirming the proposition it rained 3 hours ago on Jupiter. So it is a proposition about which we ought to be able to form a belief at will. Curley, however, suggests that he cannot form a belief about the proposition, and suggests that his readers cannot either, unless they have strikingly different minds than his. Thus, he suggests there is at least one, and probably many other clear counterexamples to the claim that people have direct voluntary control over their beliefs. Therefore, he suggests, regardless of whether direct doxastic voluntarism is conceptually impossible, it is just simply false. Now, he may or may not be wrong there. Just because there's a couple of examples he can find doesn't mean that all examples disprove DV. But it is interesting to think about these situations when, if we don't have the evidence, so it's not an evidentially based belief. So say the meteorological conditions on Jupiter, we wouldn't really truly believe that it rained 3 hours ago. We just couldn't switch that decision mode in our brain onto belief, because we wouldn't really believe it. We just can't control our belief in that way. It does seem to be an automatic aspect to our cognition. So the point of me bringing this up is a fascinating area of philosophy, and it has implications on the ethics of belief. So if we can't control our beliefs, should we be blamed or praised for holding beliefs? And that's a huge topic, and obviously I'm running out of time very quickly. But in the case of things like the arguments for and against God, and when theists come to non-theists and say, look, why don't you just believe? The reason is because we just can't believe unless we are taken over that threshold of evidence. And if we aren't taken over that threshold of evidence, then we can't really be blamed for not believing. I mean, it seems that it's either very strong evidence, or say a personal revelation, or some other kind of forceful epistemology, which gives us the rational fervour for our beliefs, the strong convictions in our beliefs. You know, that doesn't come from just willing to believe something. You believe something strongly based on some foundation, some epistemological foundation, and I don't think DV provides that at all. So, in conclusion, the idea that there is a judgmental God who will condemn us to hell for eternity for our beliefs, if our beliefs aren't voluntary, is a little incoherent to me. I hope this has been food for thought, and of course there are huge amounts of philosophy involved in this, and I have barely skimmed the surface of a couple of the arguments about DV. So I suggest looking on, say, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy is good. There's a good entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy online under Ethics of Belief. I would also advise checking out Clayton Flesher's talk that he gave. You can find it on YouTube. It's been put there by Atheist OK, and it's called Disbelief Discourses, August 2012. So that's a really good talk, interesting talk on Doxastic voluntarism. Hope this has been interesting. My name's Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and take it easy. Don't believe everything you hear. Check it out for yourselves. And don't forget to check out my blog at A Tippling Philosopher.